Hello everyone. Welcome to Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, 1956 to 1965, Japan's Women Printmakers. I'm Grace with the Japan Foundation New York's Japanese Studies team. Tonight we're pleased to bring you the 5th installment in our Illuminating Japanese Studies lecture series. This series explores the world of Japanese studies with former recipients of the Japan Foundation Fellowship Award. Since the program began in 1972, there have been more than 1,000 American awardees. They study a diverse range of topics, from pre-modern history to pop culture and everything in between. This lecture series will illuminate what exactly Japanese studies can teach us, not only about Japan, but about the world. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jeannie Kenmotsu. Dr. Kenmotsu is the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art at the Portland Art Museum, and she was also a Japan Foundation Fellow in 2012. Our moderator for the following question and answer session is Dr. Chiaki Ajioka. Dr. Ajioka is a freelance Japanese art historian, specializing in 20th century Japanese craft and modern prints. Her special interest is in cross-cultural and transnational interactions in art. For more information about our speakers, you can see the description box below this video. Please feel free to ask our speakers questions about tonight's lecture on the YouTube chat box. You can find that right here on this YouTube page. We ask that you keep the chat clean, friendly, and respectful. Now let's begin the lecture.
Good evening. My name is Jeannie Kenmotsu, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art at the Portland Art Museum. I'd like to thank the organizers of tonight's event, the Japan Foundation New York, for the invitation to speak with you all tonight and to share a little of my recent work. In particular, special thanks go to Grace Gailey, Nobuyuki Minagawa, and Genevieve Sawitz. More broadly, I am truly grateful for the Japan Foundation's ongoing support for scholarship in the field of Japanese studies, and particularly the study of art and material culture of Japan in both academic and museum contexts. I would also like to thank Dr. Chiaki Ajioka for moderating, and I look forward to the discussion after the lecture. Today, I'll be speaking about an extraordinary group of artists who came together in 1956 to collaborate in organizing group exhibitions of their work. This Society of Artists was the subject of my recent exhibition at the Portland Art Museum. Named for the society itself, the show was titled Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, 1956 to 1965, Japan's Women Printmakers. This was the first exhibition in the world to focus on this pioneering group of women artists. As I think you can begin to see already from the images on your screen, the artists themselves were not united by a shared creative ideology or artistic process. They did not work in a unified mode or aesthetic, nor in fact were they limited to a single printmaking medium. Their annual exhibitions in Tokyo were the core of their activities together, but they also organized exhibitions of their work in such far-flung places as Osaka, Honolulu, Washington, D.C., and New York City. Joryū Hanga Kyōkai was active during the 1950s and 60s, a time when printmaking thrived as an art form in Japan. For several decades prior, artists of the Sosaku Hanga, or creative print movement, had championed the creativity, labor, and genius of the individual artist, in contrast to traditional Japanese printmaking models. In the post-war period, artists emerging from the creative print movement found an enthusiastic foreign audience for their work, first with American occupation forces and later abroad in biennials and museum shows. But few women were featured in these key exhibitions and publications, or in the art societies that provided the critical infrastructure for professional artists. Within this context emerged Japan's first printmaking society for women artists, the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, or the Women's Print Association. I first became interested in this group while working on a separate project on the artist Yoshida Chizuko, whose work you see here in the lower center. I knew she had been a member of a group called the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, but the group itself was a bit of a mystery. And the more I looked in the standard texts on modern Japanese prints, in both English and Japanese languages, the more frustrated I grew, because references to this group actually abound in the literature. But virtually every mention of the group was quite shallow. They answered none of my most basic questions, such as, what was the purpose of this group? Who were the members? How long was it active? In short, this collective was certainly known at the time that they were active, but have since been largely relegated to a footnote in the history of 20th century printmaking in Japan. In my present role as curator at the Portland Art Museum, I am responsible for the stewardship of an exceptionally strong collection of modern prints, in which more than 280 modern Japanese printmakers are represented. We owe thanks to the late Gordon Gilkey, who was the museum's first curator of the graphic arts, for building the early core of that collection, which was then added to and enhanced by my predecessors, Donald Jenkins and Mary Beth Graybill. I am grateful for Portland's sustained record of engagement with Japan's modern printmaking history, and equally grateful for the generous loans from private collections in Tokyo, New York City, and Portland, which made the exhibition possible. However, with the exception of 2 prints, none of the works in the exhibition I organized had ever been shown before, which I think speaks to the general invisibility of these works in institutional collections and to the historical void into which these artists have faded. This invitation card was printed for the first Joryū Hanga Kyōkai exhibition in 1956. By this time, several founding members such as Shishido Tokuko, Yoshida Chizuko, Iwami Reika, and Kobayashi Donge were among the few women already admitted to prestigious associations, and were beginning to show their work regularly in the premier group exhibitions in Japan, such as the annual exhibitions of the Japan Print Association, or the Nihon Hanga Kyōkai. Art societies like these have been important for the professional artist in Japan throughout the 20th century. They offered a peer network, but they were also a critical vehicle for exhibition and for publicity, a way to be noticed by dealers, collectors, curators, and the public. Despite these gains in the art world of the time, the women that you see pictured here have never attained the level of fame of their celebrated male peers, some of whom were their own husbands. I'm not going to dwell at any length on this topic, but the critical role of international promotion and reception must be mentioned. And I want to make the point that it was English language publications that were really defining the genre of modern Japanese prints in the 1950s and 60s. And it was these publications that played the most significant role in how these prints were received. The pioneering work was, of course, Oliver Statler's The Modern Japanese Print, An Art Reborn. This book created essentially a canon of the modern Japanese print, at least for an American audience. It was first published in June of 1956. A second printing was already out by November of the same year. What you see here is the cover of the 13th printing in 1976, and there were still further printings after. You can easily find copies of this book today, very inexpensively. It was without a question a huge hit, shaping the knowledge and tastes of an English-speaking audience for well more than a generation. Along with Statler, James Michener, the novelist, was another key figure. Michener was a collector himself and had provided early encouragement to Statler. In fact, he wrote the introduction to Statler's book. This book on the right is a deluxe edition that was Michener's own brainchild. It was the result of a 2-part juried competition between Tokyo and New York City that was held in 1959. The deluxe version that you see here is an oversized elephant limited edition that came in a wooden slipcase, and inside are tipped in original prints by the 10 artists selected. along with commentaries by Michener. A popular edition followed in 1968, and again, that book is in libraries everywhere today. These are just two examples of the books that had an immediate effect on private collecting and institutional display in the United States. This matters in part because I believe one of the first surveys of Japanese printmaking from a Japanese perspective doesn't appear until 1967, nearly a decade later, in English. I don't want to belabor any points about gender that may already be obvious, but just to be perfectly clear, I went through Statler's book, which contains 100 illustrations by 29 featured artists. Only 2 of those illustrations are by female artists, both of whom were in the same family. Of the 10 winning artists profiled in Michener's deluxe book, 2 were women artists. Both were members of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, which is not mentioned by name. And in Kawakita Michiaki's survey, published by Kodansha in 1967, only 14 of the 119 artists are women. So what American servicemen and diplomats and their families and later tourists were taught to collect was largely shaped by a fairly specific set of preferences. In lockstep with these publications, galleries, the press, and collectors reliably supported the careers of male artists. Within this context, the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai Society provided infrastructure and professional support for women printmakers. In other words, it became a crucial vehicle for talented female printmakers to present their own artwork, which they did in consistent annual exhibitions over the next decade. As I started to piece together the exhibiting history of this society, a picture began to emerge that suggested that the Women's Print Association has to some extent been hiding in plain sight. Here you see some of the ephemera from the exhibitions they organized. They had guest books, invitation cards that announced upcoming shows, and even lists of works, which is a typical practice at art exhibitions in Japan even today, where you can get a printout of the works of art being displayed. In this photograph, you see 8 of the 9 founding members of Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. I believe at the opening for the first exhibition on October 22nd, 1956 at Yoshida Gallery. From left to right, you see Nishigai Kazuko, Yoshida Chizuko, Hayashi Tomiko, Uchima Toshiko, Kobayashi Donge, Iwami Reika, Nonaka Yuri, Shishiro Tokuko. Not pictured is Minami Keiko, who was already living in Paris by this time. Over the next decade, this small group would grow to encompass at least 25 different artists. These printmakers worked in the full range of methods. Many worked in the techniques of color woodblock printing that were the foundation of the Sosaku Hanga movement. Others specialized in intaglio techniques or lithography, and many of them experimented using new materials or creating monotypes. The rest of my talk will focus on the 5 artists who are the primary subject of the exhibition, with a little bit of the remaining time on some additional artists who joined the group over the next 10 years. Iwami Reika is probably the best known of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai artists today. Her work is found widely in North American museums, to say nothing of private collections, and her work is very recognizable. You see her here as a young woman in what I believe is the first Joryū Hanga Kyōkai exhibition in 1956. At left is a kind of signature piece of her early years. It shows the restricted palette she is known for, usually monochrome with dark reds and touches of mica. It also shows one of the themes she would repeatedly return to over her long career, that of the sea. Iwami's story is also better known than some. She was actually training as a doll maker apprenticed to a prestigious master of traditional Japanese doll carving when she discovered woodblock printmaking. Some of her background is recounted by James Michener in his book, The Modern Japanese Print. As you recall from earlier, this was Michener's big, juried project and an attempt to support and encourage contemporary printmakers. Iwami was one of 2 women selected for this deluxe book of original prints, and you can see her submission here on the right. The other was Shima Tamami, who we will see a little bit later. I included this book in the show because I think publication really helped make Iwami's career. She was already exhibiting with the Women's Print Association, also the Japan Print Association, and others, but this book, and especially the popular edition, really elevated her reputation with English-speaking audiences, and particularly collectors. Again, this is the earlier style she is known for, with deep red tones and textured grays in these kind of semi-abstracted landscapes. Her later style is also really recognizable, particularly these highly textured monochrome compositions that bring out as much character of the wood grain as possible. And like here, she uses gold and silver foil to create bright, luminous highlights. I think you can see why Iwami is such a popular printmaker. It was very sad to hear of her passing last year at the age of 93, but it's unquestionable that she had an incredibly long and productive career. It is worth pointing out that unlike many of the group's founders, Iwami never married or had children, and she had the early support of one of the biggest ambassadors for Japanese prints, James Michener. This print was made in 1964, when she was still exhibiting with Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. But already in 1964, she has hit on the overall aesthetic that she would pursue for decades. So I think that speaks to a real clarity in her artistic practice, something that she's achieved basically in the first decade of printmaking. One of the most surprising and wonderful events while working on this exhibition has been the discovery of an Iwami print unlike any I'd seen before, which you see here on the left. The print is undated, but I believe it is one of her earliest prints, and I have dated it to the 1950s based on the materials, and on the style of these curving, abstracted, serif-like shapes. This palette of rich, deep red and warm, dark yellow, and based on comparison with a few of her other early prints, which are very rare. Putting it in relationship with both her work of the late 50s and early 60s, which you see in this top row, and the later phase from about the mid-60s onward, these are all prints in the exhibition, the whole of her practice and of her career have come that much more into focus for me. So that as an art historian has been exciting, and as a curator to be able to represent Iwami's range in just a few prints for the viewer has been really rewarding. I tend to think of Yoshida Chizuko as one of the ringleaders of the Women's Print Association. Yoshida was one of the most well-connected and in some ways most established of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai artists. She married into the well-known Yoshida family of artists, headed then by Yoshida Hiroshi, the great printmaker of the early 20th century. Hiroshi's sons Toshi and Horaka had followed in his footsteps, and their mother Fujio was also a painter and printmaker. Prints were truly the family business. Chizuko had been a painter and did not begin making prints until after her marriage to Horaka. But once she started making prints, she really never looked back. The print on the right is named after Jama Masjid in Delhi, one of the largest mosques in India, which she would have seen while on her honeymoon. She and Horaka embarked on a kind of working honeymoon in 1957, traveling all around the world for a year. It is very typical of her work during the years that Joryū Hanga Kyōkai was exhibiting together with a really strong graphic sense and bold colors, which you can also see a little bit in the prints that she's handling in her studio here on the left. This photograph provides a really interesting image. It comes from a piece that was basically a photo essay of Joryū Hanga Kyōkai members, and I have to believe that they were happy to have the press coverage, but it is still very much a product of its time. At one point, the writer who has inserted these captions calls them Mama-san Hangaka, or what we might translate as, quote, mommy printmakers, unquote. And that description is so at odds with the form of self-presentation I see here with Yoshida Chizuko, who has posed herself for the camera in her studio, examining a print that she has just pulled from the woodblock. She did indeed have a family with small children to care for, like many of these women, but I think it's important to remember that this kind of language and framing was yet another challenge that they faced as artists. These are two early prints by Yoshida Chizuko. They are fairly typical of many of her earliest prints, small in size, full of energy and movement. And although the colors are perhaps less bold here, there's still this sense of exuberance, even in the use of color. Her early background was in dance and music, and this print titled Rainy Day is partly a visualization of the sound of rain falling. Many of her prints from this period were about music. In this small photograph, you can see one of her other early prints, Mambo, in the background from 1956. That print was also inspired by music. What I like about these prints is how they show she's clearly working toward that same kind of abstraction 2 years earlier, but she hasn't quite yet pared down her compositions, as she would soon begin to do, as we saw with Jama Masjid. Like Iwami, Yoshida would go on to make prints for decades. These prints were produced just after Joryū Hanga Kyōkai's life as an organization, but they indicate some of the range and the changes in Yoshida's practice. And quite frankly, I included them because they are so striking. They seem to really have that forceful visual impact that has literally stopped people in their tracks in the gallery. They're photographed here in raking light, so you can see the deep patterns created by blind embossing in the paper. There is certainly a little bit of op art and minimalist influence she is exploring here, but there's still a sense of referent. The work on the right is a landscape. It's called Landscape in Blue. Yoshida would soon shift away from this really pared down type of composition, but it does anticipate some of the work she would go on to do in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Uchima Toshiko, one of the collective's founding members, is one of the least well known today. In the early 1950s, she began exhibiting her paintings with avant-garde groups like the Democrato Artists Association. In 1954, she married Uchima Ansei, and like Yoshida Chizuko and her husband, the couple maintained a lot of connections in the world of contemporary printmakers. And I think she too might have had a leadership role in the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. Her husband Ansei had worked closely with Oliver Statler when he was interviewing artists for his book on Sosaku Hanga. Although she remained a member of the Women's Print Association for the group's entire run, in 1959, they moved together to the United States, where Ansei had been born. They settled in New York City, where she supported her husband's successful career as a practicing artist and teacher at Sarah Lawrence College and Columbia University. Here you see her with one of her prints that is in the exhibition titled Fantasy. One of the things evident in Uchima's work are certain aspects of the creative print movement, with its emphasis on expressing the interiority of the artist. There is an undeniable boldness to many of her prints, and maybe also a kind of vivid psychological force. This comes through not only in her titles, but also her palette. and the kind of forceful marks she must have made in the block with her carving tools. It's also evident in scale. These are among the largest works in the exhibition. Solitude on the left, which was shown in the group's first exhibition in 1956, this print is more than 3 feet high. It is an enormous print. In person, these works are really impressive. Wind on the right must have caught the eye of the Japan Times art critic when she visited the group's 4th annual show, for it was included above the headline of her review. Yet then there are prints like Bridge from 1965, which is so different in its mood and its subtlety. This work likely takes inspiration from the George Washington Bridge, which could be seen from the windows of the family's apartment in Manhattan. Uchima Toshiko is one of the hardest artists of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai to categorize, and I think that has to do with the fact that her printmaking lasted only a very short time. When the Uchimas moved to the United States, Toshiko continued to send prints to the annual shows and stayed an active participant in the group, but she made very few prints after the family's immigration. Her son Anju Uchima, who lent so generously to this show, has recalled that although his father's studio was right there in the home, he couldn't remember his mother ever entering the studio. Perhaps to forge a path distinct from her husband's work, Uchima left printmaking behind in 1966, turning instead to a practice of collage and assemblage. Had she continued making prints, I do wonder how her work might have developed over time. Minami Keiko was the oldest of the founding members of Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, and a bit unusual in that she lived abroad in France for much of her career. She moved to Tokyo from Toyama Prefecture at age 35 in 1946, after the end of the war. Minami had been interested in poetry and painting since she had been a child, and upon moving to Tokyo, had originally hoped to become an illustrator of children's literature. I think you can still see elements of that early interest in her etchings, like those you see here. Her touches on the plate are very fine, her colors tend to be understated, and there's that little bit of deliberate naivete in her draftsmanship that you often see in children's books. Her prints are somehow sweet, without being cloying or saccharine. The settings are sometimes fairy tale-like with castles and towers, and I think what she's especially good at is creating a scene that implies narrative. The viewer is almost looking for a story to complete each picture. Minami began etching after meeting the artist Hamaguchi Yozo, whom she would later marry. In 1954, she moved with Hamaguchi to Paris, where they would remain for nearly 3 decades. Her prints have been popular since almost the moment she began creating them. In 1956, the city of Paris acquired one of her works, and within 2 years, both the Museum of Modern Art in New York and UNICEF were reproducing her prints for greeting cards. Minami's prints are often described as delicate or whimsical, but I've wondered about the kind of gendering nature of those terms and if we would use them if she had been a male artist. The more I look at her work, the sparseness and the absences of her prints stand out to me. There is also, I think, an eerie quality to the empty spaces of her prints and to her drawing style, almost a kind of alienation or a sense of aloneness. And in talking with other art historians, comparisons to someone like Edward Gorey or even Paul Klee have come up. So an alternate reading of her work might recognize that there is also something eerie or maybe even unsettling in her prints. Another underappreciated aspect of her work, I think, is her design sense. A few of her prints, such as these, hint at other directions she might have taken. This is just speculation, of course, but like Uchima and Yoshida, Minami was married to a fellow artist, one whose career eclipsed her own, and whom she would have supported in 1,000 ways at home. I'm certain that their life in France offered some greater freedoms than Japan of the 1950s and 60s. Nevertheless, prints like these suggest some different directions in design and abstraction that remain unexplored. Kobayashi Donge's story is also that of an artist shaped by her time. In 1945, she wanted to study at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, what we know today as Geidai, but at that time only men were accepted into the prestigious art university. So instead she enrolled at Joshibi Women's University of Art and Design, where she studied in the Western painting department. This is a pretty common feature of the biographies of a lot of the women artists of this generation in Japan. Bunka Gakuin was another art school where a number of women studied they were allowed to study and take classes. Kobayashi, who is pictured here with a printing press in the background, began engraving only in 1951, when she joined a study group at the home of artist Sekino Junichiro. One of the things that I think is kind of lost when thinking about printmaking in the early 1950s is the actual difficulty of acquiring the necessary equipment. Not only did she need access to a press, but in the beginning, Kobayashi apparently had trouble getting her own tools. So something like just buying a burin, the basic tool of the engraver, was incredibly hard. And whether that was for reasons of scarcity or gender or both, I don't know. But she clearly had an affinity for the medium. She produced these surreal, dreamlike prints with so much tonal range and would coax these velvety backgrounds out, really utilizing the white of the paper in a way that the best of master printmakers can do. Early in her career, Kobayashi developed a distinct vocabulary. Femme fatales and inscrutable female figures were common. She drew equally from her own imagination and from famous works of literature and mythology. This print on the right takes up the subject from Greek myth of Zeus disguised as a swan in order to seduce Leda. Other subjects were inspired by the poet Sappho. There is an entire series dedicated to the story of Salome. But Kobayashi also took up Japanese literature. The print on the left comes from a portfolio illustrating the celebrated Japanese work Ugetsu Monogatari, or Tales of Moonlight and Rain. The title of this print, Asaji ga Yado, or House Amid the Reeds, refers to the story of a husband who returns home to a house choked by reeds due to neglect. He had deserted his faithful wife, only to find she had become a ghost while waiting for him. Kobayashi was an artist with a distinct point of view, and her depictions of seductive femme fatales and symbolist-influenced fantasies seemed to perturb exhibition reviewers and writers in the period. From what I have learned about Kobayashi and her biography, I do get the sense that she was known for something of a strong personality, which certainly in the 50s would have been remarked on in a Japanese woman. I know that she had a young son when she went to France in 1964, and she stayed there for about a year and a half. While in Paris, she spent time with Minami Keiko and Hamaguchi Yozo, who probably introduced her to a lot of people. For example, she spent time in Johnny Friedlander's studio, which was a really well-known printmaking studio at the time in Paris. She also talked about going to see art constantly while she was in France, and she has this wonderful quote where she says that she liked William Blake and Alfred Beardsley, and you can certainly see that in her work, but she hated Cézanne. She also, I think, has a real penchant for symbolist artists. The Marsh Flower, or Numa no Hana, is a title she gave to quite a few different prints. For this version, when I saw this print, I thought she must have seen this portfolio by Odilon Redon. This is his The Marsh Flower, or A Sad Human Head. Shima Tamami joined the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai in 1959 and contributed works to their fourth exhibition. As I mentioned earlier, she was one of only 2 women artists selected for Michener's deluxe limited edition book celebrating the modern Japanese print. Her signature subject is birds, so this is a fitting example of her work to include. She was another artist like Iwami who tended to search out woodblocks where the grain of the wood was especially pronounced, and it could be beautifully enhanced with tonal printing. This is a quality that I think would have especially appealed to Michener and to the American collectors he helped to cultivate, because it made visible a tangible connection to the materials of traditional Japanese woodblock printing. On the right, you see the invitation card to the 4th exhibition. It was designed by Yoshida Hodaka, Chizuko's husband. By this time, the group had moved to holding their exhibitions at the 7th floor gallery of the Toyoko department store in Shibuya. The quote at lower right on the invitation card, which basically expresses anticipation for the exhibition, was provided by the poet and art critic Takiguchi Shuzo, who by this time was also well established as an artist. Having a figure of Takiguchi's stature indicates something of their seriousness of purpose. This was not just mama-san printmakers indulging a hobby. The group's membership was fluid, but it steadily expanded over the decade. Eno Kidomaki was a slightly younger artist who joined the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai in 1963. Eno Kido had graduated from Bunka Gakuin a few years prior, and already she had won prizes in exhibitions with the Japan Print Association. At left and right are works from her early series titled Efflorescence. In Japanese, this title, Kaika, can also be translated as blooming or opening up, and indeed these are usually understood as sunflowers blossoming. A detail here shows the yellow center of the spiral, which indeed looks just like a sunflower's seeds. But I'd also argue there's a larger interest in her early work in biomorphic forms, as you can see in the vertical efflorescence print on the left and the untitled monochrome print at center. The swirling psychedelic color can be a little bit of a distraction from the very fine lines she has drawn with an etching needle. These put me in mind of artifacts from the fossil record, rather like the spiral shell of an ammonite. And of course, there were many more artists. Here you see more works from the Portland Art Museum collection. Takahashi Junko, who worked in etching, and Motoyama Michiko and Tochigi Junko, who both worked with woodblock, using bright planes of color. I was unable to fit these prints into the exhibition, but I could not resist sharing them here in making the case that the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai represented a very diverse body of work. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was a group that came together as professionals, a society that provided an essential means for talented female printmakers to present their work. You can see an installation photograph on the left of the 7th exhibition in 1962. And at right, I'm not yet sure which year this was, but this is also from one of their exhibitions, with the artists seated around the table. You can see they are relaxed, they're smiling. Looking at a photograph like this, I do think that there was a genuine sense of camaraderie that suffused their collaborations and a mutual support that likely sustained their efforts over time. I know that a number of the artists maintained friendships for decades after the group stopped exhibiting together. For example, Uchima Toshiko in New York City kept a regular correspondence with Iwami Reika in Tokyo, as well as with Moriyasu, who you see here smiling in the polka dot dress. Yoshida Chizuko also stayed in touch with many others as well. In closing, I have to say that this exhibition's warm reception by visitors to our galleries and the interest people from around the globe have expressed, all of this has reinforced for me just how needed these kinds of stories are. This exhibition at the Portland Art Museum is the first of its kind on the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, but I hope it is not the last. I hope that future scholars, collectors, and lovers of Japanese art and of 20th century printmaking will pursue further research on this remarkable group of artists. For my own part, I am working on an essay on the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai as a collective, which I hope to publish in the next year or so. For now, I hope tonight's program has piqued your interest in the artists of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, and that bringing you this piece of lost history has helped expand not only the story of modern Japanese printmaking, but also the landscape of artistic societies in the post-war years and the parameters of significant artist collectives, which merit our closer attention. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments. Well, I think we are live now, so first I'd like to thank for the wonderful invitation to speak to you all today, and also Dr. Chiaki Ajioka, who is very generously joining us from Sydney, Australia, where it is early in the morning. So I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Jeannie. Well, thank you for inviting me too. And first of all, congratulations on this groundbreaking exhibition. That's a little belated, but I think it's a wonderful work that opens up a lot of questions and a lot more possibilities. And I was just thinking, listening to your presentation, you know, the Michener's book, 1959, the competition that he organized selected 10 artists altogether. And the females, there are two females, both happen to be the member of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. And the 4 selectors were all Americans, including Oliver Statler. Do you think the 2 female out of 10 artists are sort of fair proportion, in your opinion?
Thank you. Good question. You know, it's probably a matter of subjective opinion, but I think my answer would have been different a few years ago than it is now. I think before I knew about the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, that there was this professional organization, that 25 artists were a part of it at one point or another, I would have thought, well, sure, there probably weren't very many women printmakers at the time. But I think now, you know, looking at it, the book was published in 1959.
Yeah.
So by this point, quite a number of the artists are members of not only Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, but also Nihon Hanga Kyōkai, the Japan Print Association, the general membership, which had been around for quite a while, was quite established.
Yeah.
And so in addition, you know, there were artists who never joined Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. They were already established, artists like Tokuko. So it's not as if there weren't enough women artists to choose from. And I think that if we look at Michener's book as, you know, all that was available, I think that kind of history of promotion, there's a kind of lack of visibility there that then just, it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle that we continue to think that this myth is real, that there were no women artists or there were very few. So I think my opinion on that has changed in the course of working on the exhibition.
Right. That's an interesting outcome, isn't it? Well, this sort of project actually changes your perception of the outlook. And as you pointed out, of course, the out of 9 initial members, 2/3 of them were either before or after the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai formed, the members of the Nihon Hanga Kyōkai, the Japan Print Association. And also, like Minami Keiko was in Paris, and it's very international, really. The Iwami Reika was actually born in America. Uchima Toshiko, and of course, married to Uchima Ansei, who was born in America, and they actually moved back to the United States in 1959. And and others also that go to visit like overseas. So they were international and also very well established. And I think you are really right in that the point, but it makes me think that perhaps the compared to another women's association in ceramics, it's called Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. It's very similar. It is similar in that Joryū Hanga Kyōkai was also formed. It's only year after Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, 1957, and with a similar purpose of like mutual support. But Joryū Hanga still exists, whereas Joryū Hanga Kyōkai so disbanded very quickly. And it seems to me, that they really didn't need a mutual support as much as perhaps in ceramics.
That's really interesting. I think, when you introduced me to Joryū Hanga, I hadn't heard of the group before, to my regret. And I know that they were in Kyoto, and I'd like to ask if you think that there were something, different about a women's professional group of artists who are ceramists as opposed to printmakers. And I ask in part because I think, and this is really important context that really hasn't been considered to the extent that it should, I think, by scholars in telling the story of this moment.
Yes, it's interesting because one of the founders of Joryū Hanga is actually in Australia, and she's still making. So I could actually ask her about the circumstances and the time of the formation of Joryū Hanga. And she told me that, first of all, the ceramic industry, and particularly in Kyoto, is very male-oriented. There's no question about that. And so women who took up ceramics felt the urgent pressing need to actually get together and to be counted. And so, so I asked if what's the attitude of male reporters at the time, and so interestingly, it wasn't hostile, but most of them stepped back and see what they can do. So let's see and observe. And some fairly established reporters were positively supportive of the movement. So when I think of those two, very interesting that the printmaking after the war was very supported by mainly American occupation, the force from the start. In the last few decades, there has been quite a lot of study of on the art during the occupation period, and that's what's coming out. It's very interesting, and by scholars like Professor Kuwahara, that occupation force when they settled mainly in Tokyo, they set up the monument men. They sent monument men to survey the damages, but also they set up Army Education Center and to educate the Army, the personnel. And one of the main important, particularly for the artists, the Japanese artists, was that they organized exhibitions and concerts aimed for occupation personnel and their families for the purpose of educating them with the Japanese culture and art. and the officer in charge was William Hartnett, and he quickly became a supporter of discovered Sosaku Hanga, and he was a collector, and through him, Oliver Statler sort of came into the scene, and they really supported. So, as Kuwahara-san points out, that the fact that the artists could hold an exhibitions in the occupation space, that meant it was just opening the window to all sorts of possibilities, particularly keeping in mind that during the war, there were a lot of Japanese artists were so hungry with the information of what was happening outside Japan, they couldn't get it. And the occupation force also established libraries for the Japanese, where some artists got a lot of information about what was happening overseas. So in that sort of environment, it's very different from the ceramics, particularly in Kyoto. So that's very important to point to consider. And of course, early 1950s, that the Japanese prints, with all this support, started winning international prizes ahead of the other, like the forms of art in Japan. And Hiroe Suen, who was one of the founders and of Joryū Toge, and she said that the time was just so exciting time, like mid 1950s, for all artists, and particularly for her and her colleagues, that there was a lot of possibilities and hope for the future, exciting time. And it's very important to consider that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that context. I think that's so essential for our understanding of how sort of the story of modern Japanese prints in this period, and particularly in comparison with other media. I mean, one of the things that I'm often asked in relation to this exhibition, and that we've been asked, is about what kinds of barriers there were for women printmakers. And I think some of what you've just outlined actually demonstrates that, in fact, it was, relatively speaking, more open in many ways than it had been. You know, I mentioned that Kobayashi Donge, she really wanted to go to Tokyo University of the Arts. You know, she said this, and the very next year, women were allowed.
Yes,
you know, she was just off. So, you know, I think, you know, I know Yoshida Chizuko talks about that moment in the 1950s as a really exciting moment when all of these ideas are overflowing. So I think in many ways it was really quite a positive time and a positive experience in that way. And again, I don't want to belabor, you know, issues of gender, and I think it's very difficult to. One of the struggles I've had is reading biography here in the context of an artist's career, and particularly in relation to issues of gender. But there's really no getting around the fact that many of these women who were married or who had children, that there were different ways in which they might have interacted with occupation forces, for example. I think about, you know, Uchima Ansei is... he's credited in the beginning of, I think, Oliver Statler's book, but I think it doesn't do justice to how essential he was to Oliver Statler, because I think he facilitated introductions, he translated, you know, he was a pivotal figure. And it's hard for me to imagine Oliver Statler developing that kind of intimate working relationship with Ansei's wife, Uchima Toshiko. Which is not to say it couldn't have happened, but you know, it was a specific moment there. So So a bit of a balance of give and take in terms of the barriers and the opportunities that were afforded to these artists.
Yeah. Yes. Another thing I noticed, and what's coming out in the recent studies, is that a lot of artists had a pre-war international connections, had personal connections since before the war and even during the war. And so that was very strong, particularly like the Yoshida family that was had been really important. So Yoshida Chizuko, even though she married, when did she marry?
1953, she marries.
53. Okay, a few years before that. But the family that she married into had such extensive and close relationship with Americans.
Exactly.
And in that, the Army Education Center, Yoshida Hiroshi and Toshi, I think his son, one of his sons, actually did a demonstration of the woodblock, the printing. And that sort of things does not happen just suddenly, like without really very strong trust and relationship with that. And it is very interesting. The more I look into the personal connections and how that played out, and particularly for artists, because artists are, I think, by nature intercultural. So it's really interesting that if we listen to just hear about just Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, and you think that's something that formed in Japan, but it's actually much more international than that. And also the quality of their works, it's just stunning. And I was just amusing that in one of the photographs that you showed of the women in the like lounging and smiling and like in the more like the casual setting, and it really I feel the camaraderie and also professional confidence from the photos of the individual artists.
Yeah, I think I apologize for the quality of those photographs in a digital PowerPoint than in a live stream, but the originals are really small. So still identifying some of the artists there. But I think it's really evident. There are some photographs I've seen where it must be after an opening or maybe a meeting, and they're gathered around, the dishes are all bada on the table and scattered. There's a baby, they're really, there's a sense that they are friends as well as colleagues. I think it's quite powerful. I wanted to go back just briefly to this point you made about international connections and say that I think it's really striking that you bring this up, because there are certain artists where we know quite a bit about them because of their family connections. So the Yoshida family, for instance, they were very well practiced at. Yoshida Hiroshi had probably done demonstrations for Americans any number of times before this. I think he had his first exhibition in Detroit was in like the 19, I mean, very, very early. He had a number of exhibitions in 1920, so quite early. I think there's a level of comfort. But then there's also artists I discovered who must have been well known by their peers, who I can find hardly anything about now. So Shishido Tokuko is one of the founders. I know that I don't know if she was born in California, but certainly she studied, I think she studied at what's now Cal Arts in the Bay Area. and kind of moves back and forth between the United States and Japan. She actually was admitted to the Japan Print Association, I think in the same year that Yoshida Chizuko was. So this is an artist who's not invisible, right, at the moment, but who has just kind of, for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, it's really difficult to find her work now. It's difficult to find out what her path was, and there's a fair number where that's the case.
I think, yes, you made a point that I find that a lot of artists get dropped out or just become outside the what you call it, when the art historians study Japanese art, for example, in Japan, and American art is not interested in Japanese artists just doing here and there. So those very important, as you said about Uchima Ansei, made such an important role in connecting those, but they tend to get less attention, unfortunately, and hopefully this will change and there will be more things that the study is carried out about the actions and identification of these artists like Shishido. Yes.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm really quite inspired by your work and Professor Kuwahara Noriko as well. I mean, I think these are really important topics to investigate further.
Yeah. I think, can we perhaps take questions? Hello.
Well, I mean, I think that I would start by saying prints have kind of always been modern. I mean, as a medium. I mean, even in the early modern period, so 16th century, print was the hot deal. But I think that more to the point in the 20th century, I think there was a real sense among the artists of Joryū Hanga Kyōkai that it's not as if they were so far away from the avant-garde. I think that it's very interesting that we have a number of wonderful studies of what we call avant-garde Japanese art from this same moment in the 1950s and 60s that almost never touches printmaking. It might be within an artist's practice, and so it might be mentioned as part of an artist's practice. But we tend to be focused in those cases, or I should say scholars tend to be focused on forms like installation and performance and so forth, things that we think of as quote unquote contemporary. But I think artists' practice are wide. They were in the 1950s and 60s in Japan, just as they are today. And I think, the fact that Takiguchi Shuzo, for instance, is someone who's engaging their work and, writing essentially a kind of a endorsement of an upcoming exhibition is one of the indications of that. So it's a complex case.
Thank you.
And also, some artists like that from about 1980s, so-called contemporary art, and in Japan, some printmakers actually merging, printmaking has partly merged into the larger contemporary art practice, which is also, of course, the really diverse in medium and also different media.
Thank you both for your answers. So now I'm going to move on to the questions that we have gotten from YouTube Live. And audience members, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box now so that we have time to get to them. So our first question comes from Elias. He says, as a collector of Sosaku Hanga, I must admit that many of these designs are new to me. Can you speak about the edition numbers of any of these prints? Were they executed in more than, say, 10 or 20 impressions?
That's a very good question. I will say that of the early prints, and there are some artists, of course, the caveat is there are some artists I know more about than others. I've seen more of their work. But for those that I know more of, absolutely, in the 1950s especially, it tends to be editions of 10 or less. I've seen editions of 7, editions of 2. Yoshida Chizuko, for example, quite a bit later in her career makes much larger editions, as you might expect. But early in her career, they're very few, relatively speaking. It depends on the format. Some of the smaller prints are made in larger sizes. Uchima Toshiko's prints, I think her editions are anywhere from 2 to 10, typically. So quite small. That's a good question. Thank you.
Mm.
And just to clarify, we might have people in the audience who study traditional Japanese woodblock printing, like Edo period woodblock printing, and those were executed by teams of artisans. So there would be the designer who draws the print, and then somebody who specializes in carving the woodblock, somebody that specializes in applying the pigment and pressing the paper. But were they all executed by one artist?
Yes, that's a great question, and probably something I glossed over that I should not have. Yes, you know your Edo period woodblock printing history well. It's almost inevitably a team of craftsmen and a publisher. In the case of Sosaku Hanga, really sort of elevated might not be the right word, but really staked out ground around being work executed by a single artist. I think later they started to say it's okay if someone else printed it, but really, you should carve it and you should design it and you should print it. And that is the tradition that Joryū Hanga Kyōkai comes out of. That's true for the woodblock print artists of these women artists, as well as those who are etching or working in other methods. This is something that I know you've written a fair bit about, Chiaki. That Sosaku Hanga. It's not necessarily the parameters of it are not necessarily what we might think of in terms of a certain type of artistic grouping, but that there are certain shared characteristics, and that certainly from an earlier moment, that's one of the defining ones.
Yes, that's when Sosaku Hanga emerged, like around the turn of the century. The artists just needed to control the whole process, and there was a big and long drawn argument and sort of hostilities between the Shin Hanga, which was the much more elaborate, like neo ukiyo-e, the school came out around the same time with Sosaku Hanga, but that was created by, like in the old ukiyo-e, like the designer, block cutter, and the printer. But I think the main thing that was with the Shin Hanga or neo ukiyo-e, and also in the old ukiyo-e, the publisher was the main controller. So even when the Sosaku Hanga artists got something professional the printers to get their the impressions made, artists still had the control. And I think that was the main, because when you start thinking about, well, so this impression was done by this professional artisans, therefore this is not Sosaku Hanga. And this sort of argument becomes very tricky. And the barrier or the division is very sort of blurred. But I think it's important to think that who was actually in control of the piece of work. And in Sosaku Hanga, definitely the artist or designer.
Thank you. So I think that also sheds some light on, if it's just a run of 10 prints, but that's all done by one person, that seems like a lot of work. So our next YouTube live question comes from Chika. She says, great presentation. Looking back now and analyzing these works by women printmakers, what do you think are the political and cultural significances of our act of bearing witness to their works?
Big question.
Well, I can't say I haven't thought about this, actually. I mean, I thought the genesis of this show was really, in part, I mentioned my frustration. That's part of it. I think a lot of good scholarly questions come out of scholarly frustrations. But also, I thought, is it enough? Is it enough to just bring them to light? And I think the structure of the presentation reflects in some ways the structure of the exhibition. I didn't try to do thematic groupings overly much. I made selections that made sense from a specific artist in relation to another artist, but I didn't hang them together. Eventually, to cut a story short, I decided, it's enough. I mean, I think it's enough to make an intervention and say, yes, in fact, this was an active professional organization. It probably deserves another look. You may have never seen any of these artists before. There are some I had never seen before. And so I suppose, from a personal perspective as a specialist in the field, I felt like, that's a kind of, intervention to make in, it's a kind of stand to make.
So shall I continue with the questions?
Oh,
did you have a
well,
question?
I think, no, I think Jeannie said that all.
Okay. That was a very involved question. So thank you.
Yes.
So we have another question from YouTube from Erwin. He asks, did any of this group of women artists have involvement with Onichi Koshiro, died in 1955? Did he serve as a mentor to any women print artists that you know of?
So the question is about Koichi Koshiro and
Onichi Koshiro.
Okay. Onichi Koshiro. Yes, in fact, quite a number of them had direct or indirect associations with Onichi. He was less of a mentor figure directly to them than some other famous names that I'm sure Erwin would know. For instance, Sekino Junichiro, I think really played a really important role with many of these artists. We could name some others in addition, and Chiaki, feel free to bring them up. But, in regards to Sekino Junichiro, that's a story that I think, at least in English-speaking contexts, we haven't told fully. Sekino is someone that we know as a woodblock print artist, primarily, so much color, really beautiful color woodblock prints of a wonderful size. Those particular prints are really beloved, but he was also experimenting with other media. I know that he actually owned one of the only available intaglio presses in Tokyo at the time, and he started a little research group. I think they called themselves the Dobanga Kenkyūkai. You know, so it's a kind of study group for copper plate printing, which encompasses all forms of intaglio printing. And so a number of these artists really were learning techniques and discussing them together at Sekino's home, in that home studio. And so Kobayashi Donge, for instance, she had been introduced to, I think, engraving by Komai Tetsuro, but then she joins Sekino's study group. And I know that the Yoshidas were there, Nonaka Yuri, one of the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai artists, was there, and a number of others. And that's where Kobayashi really studied aquatint and etching. So, which, as you can see in her prints, is essential to her practice. I mean, within it, just immediately, this is what she picks up, and she continues to do that for decades. I would also say about Sekino, he becomes, after Onchi Koshiro's passing, he becomes the kind of administrative director. I'm not sure to exactly what that authority entailed, but he becomes kind of the leader of Nihon Hanga Kyōkai for at least those first initial years. And it's in mostly those years that more women begin joining the Japan Association. And so that's a little bit anecdotal and speculative on my part, but I really think that he really helped to mentor a large generation of not just young female artists, male artists as well, but I think he was really instrumental.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's interesting when reading Sekino's book about his personal relation to other. He names Minami Keiko, Uchima, Yoshida, Kobayashi, Iwami, Nonaka, and Enokido. Yeah, they are all in Sekino's the group. And so those particularly Nonaka Yuri, she joined as a high school student and with her mother, who was a painter. And so from his description of those women, I couldn't really detect any distinction between male, female, and he was so open and generous in his advice and just facilitating the artists with the press and just providing opportunity. And even when the artists came, because it was in his house, it was not big, his wife and had to go out with a little child to make room. And so I think that was really important of his role. And of course, he was very close to Onchi. He printed a lot of Onchi's work as well. And so that was, even though this came after Onchi's death, there's a very strong connection, not so much as Onchi's influence, but I think it's like the culture of, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So we still have about 10 minutes left. YouTube folks, if you have more questions, feel free, please, to ask them now. But while we wait, do you mind if I ask a question of my own?
Oh, of course.
Okay. So I'm curious, as a curator, how do you go about sourcing artworks and other materials for an exhibition? You talked a bit about how these works began to be collected in the American occupation and how that catalog of modern prints became like a guidebook for collectors to go to Japan and purchase more artworks. So I imagine that you mentioned that they appear in museums and private collections. So I'm curious how you go about finding where these works are located, how you go about selecting works, as well as ephemera. So the invitations, the photographs, the catalogs, how do you find those, and how do you choose what to include?
Thank you. That's a great question. You know, luck or good fortune is always a part of, of this. As I mentioned, Gordon Gilkey, who incidentally was one of the Monuments Men in Europe, he's better known for that actually, probably than as the curator of graphic arts in Portland, but unquestionably he left an incredible legacy behind here in Oregon. It's really remarkable that when I look at the number of modern Japanese printmakers in the collection today, there's 280 different names. I mean, 280 different artists. You know, as I said, my predecessors have also added to the collection, but really the core of that was created relatively early. So you know, some of it is that we have a real strength in that area in the collection. And as I mentioned, only 2 of those prints had ever been shown before. So you know, it felt like time to get them out and on display. In addition, I think, you know, we're talking a lot about networks, you know, among artists, but I think networks are really essential for curators as well. I mean, knowing not only what scholarship is out there, but also where those kinds of allied strengths are in other collections. I was really fortunate in doing this exhibition to be able to work with private collections, one here in Portland from the wonderful Erwin Lavenberg, as well as private collections in Tokyo and New York City. And I have to say, without that kind of assistance and generosity from private collectors, the show would look very different. In particular, something like archival material, you know, the ephemera you're talking about, all the photographs that you saw come from descendants of the children of 2 of the artists. And if it weren't for that family archive, you know, these photographs, to my knowledge, are not at Tobunken. They have not yet made it into the archives in Japan. I know that they will. You know, I know that will be important. But without that kind of family knowledge, it's virtually impossible to do. So the last thing, and then the last thing I'll say is that I started to plan this exhibition in late 2019, not knowing how things were going to evolve over the next 6 months. Yeah. And doing this exhibition in 2017 or hopefully 2022 probably would look a lot different. I have not been able to travel to any archives. I have not been able to even go to a university library. So I've really relied on you know, the resources that I have or the generosity of others in scanning materials for me and so forth. So exhibition planning in a pandemic is you know, I don't recommend it if you have a choice, but it came with its own kind of challenges and limitations. And so, you know, I've always gone into this with my eyes wide open, knowing that there were certain limitations to what I could accomplish in a 2020 exhibition.
Well, you wouldn't be able to tell that it was a pandemic exhibition from your talk. So I think you did very well.
Very good.
So you just mentioned briefly some of the remaining family members of these women artists. Did you get to speak with them directly? Did you get to meet them, or pandemic, did you get to talk to them on Zoom?
Well, I've been fortunate to be in touch with Uchima Anju, the son of Ansei and Toshiko. And I have to say, without his generous loans to the exhibition, we don't have any Uchima Toshiko prints at the Portland Art Museum. I was able to borrow one from Tokyo, but otherwise I did not have any kind of visual sense of her work other than from photographs. So that's just opened up my mind in a whole new way. And I know that Kuwahara-san is assisting with an exhibition of Uchima's work in Japan coming up. And then I'm also in touch with another descendant for another project, and that has been, that's been a treasure trove of materials and ephemera. And so no in-person visits, but yes, certainly a lot of email and phone calls and so forth. But I think, Chiaki, you know a little bit more about the exhibition that's planned in Japan. Do you know the dates for that show?
Well, with this pandemic, I don't know. So, but we hopefully, I think there's more work to be done, and we just wait for the border opening. I think, I personally would like to, to come to visit the States as well.
I think we're all hoping that travel restrictions will ease soon and the global health situation will improve vastly and swiftly.
Yes.
So I think we're at the point where we're going to wrap up tonight's talk. And I always like to end by asking about what projects you have coming up. So Jeannie, you mentioned a publication at the end of your lecture. And Chiaki, you just mentioned an exhibition in Japan. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I'll start. I do plan to publish an essay about the Joryū Hanga Kyōkai. I didn't mention, but I sometimes do. I think one of the reasons they have been hard to kind of find, even though they're in the literature, but to really find anything about them is really just when you translate Joryū Hanga Kyōkai, it's just Women Printmakers Association. And I think that, in the period, especially, it wasn't a very, it wasn't a splashy name. So I think just having some of that basic research material out there and some of the data that I've found, I'd really like to be able to share that, in publication form, and then hope that other scholars will pick it up and take it further. So that's the project for me.
Well, Uchima's show is actually I'm not really involved in that. My colleague, Kuwahara-san, and the curator in Tochigi, Kimura-san, Reika, they are working really hard on it. But for my own interest is, my main, the project at the moment is Mingei, and how the Mingei more outside Japan, and how that sort of changes quite a lot the history of what we have thought about Mingei when we focus on the network outside Japan. But apart from that, with the prints, another printmaker, very important that we sort of talked about, that they get dropped out from the Japan, because it is sort of difficult to trace the activities outside Japan, and from outside Japan, it's more difficult to know closely about the particular artists' activities and circumstances in Japan. That's the Yamagishi Kazue, and I think he was very important in terms of spreading, teaching woodblock printmaking around the early decades of the 20th century. And there was a small exhibition in Japan, but it would be really interesting to actually put his sort of activities together in what he did in America, and also his role, particularly his role, yes, and a lot of people, curators and the scholars in the States are very interested in the role that he played. So that's something that once we can travel, really like to dig a little more.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. So we have a lot to look forward to post-pandemic. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Post-pandemic.
Post-pandemic.
Yes.
Well, thank you both so much for your time this evening. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Again, this has been the Illuminating Japanese Studies lecture series with Japan Foundation New York, and we hope you have a good night. Thank you.
Thank